Semester number 2, lesson number 4. Our aim today is how did the day-to-day life of Americans change during World War II? And we want our focus today to really, reflect how people in America were helping out with the war that was going on in Europe and in Asia. And if we recall World War I and we look back on that, America adopted this policy of total war, where everything that was going on in the country was really focused on the war effort. And the same thing is going to happen during World War II, actually to an even greater extent. And you're going to see that the day-to-day lives of every person in America changed in some way. And the goal in general was to, be successful in the war. With that being said, today we are looking at the home front, all right? The people in America that did not go fight in the war, but were an important part of the war, all right? And the thing we should start by focusing on was this concept that everything is going towards the cause. Everything that they were doing in America in some way focused on the cause, all right? An indication of this is the victory gardens. People planted these quote-unquote victory gardens to help combat the food shortages. And it was interesting because in the city, people even had these gardens on their rooftops, all right? And the point was people were trying to grow their own food so that the food that was being grown commercially could be shipped off to the soldiers, and they had everything they needed. So basically, they were just trying to combat food shortages by asking people to produce their own foods when possible. And another instance of this is the rationing books. All right, people were given ration coupons for goods such as gas, coffee, sugar, tires, and meats. And when you talk about the rationing cards, all right, the point was, if you remember, think back to World War One, much more in World War II. Everything's towards the war effort, so they want to ensure that their soldiers have everything they need. And with that being said, first crack at gas, coffee, sugar, tires, meats, the first people that get those things are the soldiers. And when it gets to the public, there is a limited amount that can go around. So basically, they ration the amount of goods people can get. And a ration, for example, your family wants a steak. They might have one ration coupon per week. So once per week, they can buy a steak. All right. And this was meant to ensure that, like we said, everything everything in the military is going okay, and they're getting everything they need. All right. Carpools became very popular during this time to limit the amount of gasoline being used by the people, by the public. They had rubber drives where people would donate old scrap rubber to for the cause. And here you have on the bottom here you have two examples of on the left, bottom left is a gasoline ration card, and then on the right is a ration book, and on the top you have a slogan for Victory Gardens. And going along with that, if we look over here, all right, you have probably one of the most famous pictures in American history, Rosie the Riveter, right? And Rosie the Riveter's job was to encourage women to be an active member in the war effort and be part of the production line. Which, if you look in the top right picture, all right, women were not just doing small little jobs; they were doing the real serious work to ensure that things were getting done for the men on the front line. All right, I really do think that picture on the top right, especially, defines what women did during this time and how important they were to the war effort. All right, without the women doing what they did, World War II would have never ever been a success for the United States. So they were just as important to the war effort as the men. So after Pearl Harbor, all right, there is this real distrust for the Japanese Americans, whether or not that is fair. All right, America was paranoid, and they had declared war the next day after Pearl Harbor on the Japanese Americans. And after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Americans started to question the loyalty of Japanese Americans. All right, they forced Japanese Americans to sell their homes and businesses, and they sent them to relocation camps. All right, these relocation camps are sometimes referred to as internment camps. All right, now these relocation or internment camps are absolutely in no way like the work or concentration camps that we saw going on in Europe with Hitler. All right, these are very different. These people were treated, I don't want to say great, but they were given, everything they needed. They were not forced to do hard work and whatnot. Basically, it was just a way that America was able to keep tabs on all the Japanese Americans to ensure that they weren't, spying for the Japanese or they weren't against the war effort in any way. Whether or not this was right was a questionable thing. And there was even a Supreme Court case on this. You guys might want to write this down in your Supreme Court list. All right. Very important case. Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. This was a Supreme Court case questioning the constitutionality of Japanese internment camps. And Fred Korematsu, in the picture on the right, he argued that it was unconstitutional to deprive Japanese Americans of their life and liberty by forcibly putting them in these internment or relocation camps. However, the Supreme Court decided in favor of the federal government under the reason that the safety of the whole was more important than the civil liberties of the few. And if we think back to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, right, the powers of the federal government get stronger and people's civil liberties can be taken away to some degree. All right, with the idea that the most important thing is the safety of the whole rather than the civil liberties of a select group. So in wartime, this kind of stuff can happen because the safety of the whole is of most importance. All right, and on a separate note, African Americans during World War II played a huge role, and African American employment during the war doubles. All right, African Americans were still forced to fight in all black units during World War II. All right, the Tuskegee Airmen were very well known, and they were an African American group of fighter pilots who destroyed 400 enemy aircrafts by the end of the war. The movie came out, I believe, 2 years ago. Red Tails is all about the Tuskegee Airmen. Very, very, skilled group of fighters, and they were extremely important to the war effort. All right. Once again, African Americans believed that by fighting in this war, maybe they would be, more well respected after the war, and that's not exactly the case. However, they were incredibly important to the war effort. Checking for understanding. Base your answer on the following question. The director of the War Relocation Authority is authorized and directed to formulate and implement a program for the removal from the areas designated from time to time by the Secretary of War or appropriate military commander under the authority of Executive Order 9066 of February 19th, 1942, of the persons or classes of persons designated under the executive order and for their relocation, maintenance, and supervision. Shortly after this executive order was signed, federal government authorities began to 1. Move Japanese Americans to internment camps, 2. Deport German and Italian aliens, 3. Detain and interrogate Chinese immigrants, or 4. Arrest the individuals who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. All right, and if you look at this quote, Executive Order 9066 and Executive Order 9102 deal with a specific thing, all right, but really it has to do with what we learned today. Our independent work today, all right, Korematsu versus the United States was a Supreme Court case that questioned the constitutionality of Executive Order 9102, internment camps for Japanese Americans. Your task: discuss whether you agree or disagree with the ruling in Korematsu versus the United States. Make sure you to discuss both sides of the argument and why you believe the ruling was right or wrong. All right? That has to be at least 5 to 6 sentences. We will talk more about this tomorrow. Have a good night.